I'd like to start off today's program by saying how grateful I am to have the opportunity to live, learn, teach, and play on the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people here in Vancouver, British Columbia. And it's from working with them and learning from and with them that we can incorporate best practices of learning and taking care of the land that we are on to bring great programs like today's Tales from the Deep to you. So with that wonderful start to today and seeing so many people giving us a warm hello in the chat, I'd like to turn it over to Amanda.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Hello, everyone. I'm really excited to be here today to tell you a little bit about what I do and some of the research that I get to work on. So I'm just going to share my screen, get it all set up here. All right, how's that looking? Good? Excellent. All right, so as Danica mentioned, my name is Amanda Weltman. I work in the Ocean Biodiversity Research Program, and I'm going to talk to you today about a project that combines arts and science for conservation. More specifically, this project also looked at how we can protect rockfish by creating new habitat. Before I get into the details, however, I just want to give you a little background on where we do our research and some of the conservation issues surrounding rockfish in case you don't know too much about these species. So for those of you that are tuning in from outside of Vancouver, this, of course, is a map of North America. And you can see that little red box there. I'm going to zoom in on that, and you can now see that's where Vancouver is located. And then I have another red box for Howe Sound, and this is where we do the majority of our research. This is a really important area because it's undergone a lot of many environmental changes over the years, and we monitor what's happening to life underwater. So from glass sponges to sea stars of lingcod. We actually have the longest ongoing monitoring program in the Strait of Georgia, which has been going for about 40 years. So the one animal that I'm going to focus on today that we monitor are rockfish. And this is a photo of a tiger rockfish. They are a commercially important groundfish species, and you can find 37 different species all over British Columbia. These fish are particularly interesting because they are homebodies, meaning they don't migrate from where they live. So kind of like us right now during COVID, if you're staying at home all the time. They can also live a really long time. Some species like the yellow eye rockfish can actually live up to about 120 years, which is really impressive. When they have babies, they can have hundreds of thousands of offspring, but they mature really late, so it might be many years before they actually first reproduce. And if young fish are caught when they haven't matured, this will of course negatively affect the population. So something that we try to avoid from happening. We're interested in these fish because unfortunately they face a lot of threats. First being overfishing and bycatch. Many rockfish populations have been overfished or caught accidentally by taking too many out of the ocean, especially the young fish that haven't had many chances or any chances to be able to reproduce. Because of overfishing, in fact, there are two species that we no longer see in Howe Sound, black rockfish and Boccaccio rockfish. They were actually extirpated from Howe Sound in the 1960s. As a bit of history, rockfish catches were also only defined to the species level in 1996. So prior to that, there are about 5 species that were commercially fished that were grouped together as red rockfish. So they were just kind of catching whatever, and there was not much conservation going on for them. If you go back a little bit further, there were also no fishing restrictions prior to 1986, which is when they introduced fishing licenses. So the catches actually increased fourfold between 1986 and 1990, and Howe Sound rockfish reached historic lows in the 1990s due to fishing pressures. With the protections that we have today, we actually haven't seen large increases in many of the rockfish populations off of our coast, unfortunately, but it should be noted that it will actually take many years before we see an increase in these populations due to their long lifespan and late maturity. There's also a lack of compliance, which leads to lack of knowledge about conservation areas and fishing restrictions. And unfortunately, this has led to illegal poaching of rockfish as well. And this has happened more recently than you would think. This is an article that came out last year. It's September 2019. This seizure of illegal rockfish only took place again last year, and these fishermen were only caught because they had no trailer lights on their truck, and they got pulled over for a safety violation. Once pulled over, the RCMP could smell the fish, and they got the illegal catch. So had their car been totally fine, they may have never caught all of these fish. And in this photo, you can see the China rockfish that they caught. So they had 71 China rockfish, and the legal limit is 1 per person per day. So they definitely exceeded that. They also had canary rockfish, they had black rockfish, vermilion rockfish, king cod, and a couple other species of fish as well. So this happens, unfortunately. Unfortunately, not everyone gets caught, and that's definitely still an issue that needs to be addressed and improved on. Now, the next issue that they face, I'm going to warn you, the photo is a little bit graphic, so I apologize. But barotrauma is something that can also affect rockfish. So the catch and release protocols for rockfish are unique because if they're brought to the surface really quickly, their swim bladder expands with gas and it protrudes from their mouth, which is what you're seeing in this photo, and actually reduces their likelihood of survival. This barotrauma is something that can happen, but it can be reversed as well. But you have to have specialized equipment, and you won't necessarily have that unless you're prepared for it or know that this can happen. Not all species of rockfish are affected in the same way. So black rockfish and yellowtail rockfish may not be quite as affected, but basically it's just by taking up these rockfish too fast, they didn't pressurize quickly enough, and sometimes it can lead to death as well. The last issue that I'm going to be talking about is habitat loss. This is an issue that takes place all over the world, so it's not just here, and it doesn't just affect rockfish. It can happen because of fishing gear damage. It can even just be coral bleaching. When corals die, that's habitat loss. In this photo in particular, what you're looking at is a damaged glass sponge reef. It's possible that some fishing gear went through there. Who knows? But these are really delicate ecosystems. They're glass sponge reefs. They're made of glass. So they're very, very delicate. And these reefs can provide homes to rockfish, which is why I'm highlighting them here. So with all of these issues, what is being done to help rockfish? Well, very quickly, in 2007, 164 rockfish conservation areas were established all over BC, and within Howe Sound, there were 11 that were established there, which you can see in the orange boxes. In a rockfish conservation area, you can't go hook and line fishing for any fish, and in Howe Sound in particular, right now there's an extra closure where you can't go fishing for rockfish or lingcod anywhere, which is really great, and that helps their population as well. In my office, we conduct the annual Rockfish Abundance Survey, and this actually, we just finished it for 2020. We do it from between August and October. This is when we get good visibility, and usually these rockfish are out from their hiding areas. They like to hide in rocky reefs. And this is our 16th year actually conducting this survey. So it's really exciting that we have this long-term data set and that we get to continue this, because the purpose of this survey is to estimate rockfish abundance in a given area and show how populations are changing over time. So this research actually helped to the establishment of the rockfish conservation areas, and through long-term monitoring, it can help us to understand the population recovery of these species as well. Just to give you an idea of how that translates into what we see from year over year, this is just one graph that I took from our 2018 report, and it just compares 6 different areas in British Columbia that are regularly surveyed. And you can actually see that in 2018, there's a huge surge in Victoria. So you're thinking, oh, that might be really, really great. What happened in 2018? Well, when we looked at the data, there was actually what we call a year class of yellowtail rockfish. So tons and tons of babies, they survived. We saw them in Victoria, and then the next year we actually saw them in Howe Sound as well. So this is a really good sign, because events like this don't happen every single year. So it's really exciting when we do see it and we can document it, and then we can also see the survivability of the adults in a later year. So this is really, really great. So a couple years ago, we started another project in addition to these rockfish abundance surveys that were for rockfish, but it more addressed the population loss through creating habitat. When it comes to the ocean and the words creating habitat, one image that might come to mind are artificial reefs. Maybe, maybe not. Artificial reefs have been employed all over the world, so most notably in tropical areas, and they've been successful at recruitment and increasing biodiversity, as you can see in some of the photos here. They can take on many different forms, like car tires, which you see in the top left. They could be concrete blocks, sunken ships. If any of you watching are divers, perhaps you've been diving on artificial reefs yourself, and we have quite a few here in British Columbia as well, which is super exciting if you do get that opportunity to dive on them and see them for yourself. Now, depending on the artificial reef, there are pros and cons to the different types of material that you use. So car tires, for example, they might be slow to colonize different species, and larvae may not settle super well. If you're going to a metal ship, they're good for colonizing, but sometimes metals, depending on what kind of metal, could deteriorate faster than other materials. Concrete and ceramics are other choices that people might use for creating artificial reefs. They're durable, moldable, and they can vary in texture, which sometimes is really good for invertebrate sediment as well. So some artificial reefs have also been designed by artists, and that's really what I'm getting to in my presentation today. So we decided to take this concept of artificial reefs and to see if they would be a suitable habitat restoration method for rockfish. Not only were we looking at artificial reefs, but we wanted to see if by making them artistic that we could engage the public and use art as a tool to connect people to nature. So we asked the following questions. Will rockfish use the sculptures? Are some reef designs more effective than others? And is art an effective tool to connect people to nature? So for this project, we actually collaborated with students from two universities, Kwantlen Polytechnic University and the University of British Columbia. And through a series of workshops, they actually designed sculptures made of concrete and clay that suited specific criteria mimicking rockfish habitat. So I have a couple examples that you can see on the screen here. These were some of their initial ideas of what they wanted to design and build based off of the criteria that we gave them. And then you can see how that transformed into their actual reef sculptures. So some stayed very similar and some completely changed their concept. But you can see that they have textured surfaces, they have cracks and crevices, escape pathways from predators, hidey holes, lots of different characteristics that we wanted to see incorporated. And it's really neat to see how they're all different and how all these artists interpreted the information that we gave them, because it allows us, again, to really understand if some species prefer one design over another, or maybe they just don't care. Maybe they're just, it's habitat, it is what it is, and they're just going to go to whatever's closest to them. That's something that, we wanted to know. So in the end, we had a total of 9 sculptures, which you can see on the screen here. Again, all very different, but all super awesome. And I actually have a question for all of you watching, and you can use the chat box. This is my little interactive moment of the presentation. But because, again, one of the points of this project is to see, are people more connected to nature through art. So I'm curious to know if any of you have first impressions about these sculptures. Do they evoke any emotions for you? Do you think that they would enhance your connection to nature if you saw them in the ocean when you went scuba diving? And you don't have to write anything, but I'm just really curious personally to know if you have any thoughts about these sculptures here. So once these were all done and completed, we actually placed them at 2 locations in Howe Sound so that we could create 2 reefs we would be able to monitor. So the first was created in July of last year, in 2019, and the second one was created actually in February this year, just before all the COVID shutdowns. But I'll focus on the first one here, which is in Porto Cove Marine Park. As you can see on the map in the top right, the park is located in the northern part of Howe Sound. So we placed our sculptures on that red dot in the middle of your screen, in the water there. And at that spot, before we put our sculptures in, there was little to no marine life. So we were hoping that not only would it maybe attract rockfish, but it would attract other biodiversity as well. Another reason why we chose this park is because it's really popular with the dive community, and it's already home to some other artificial reef structures. So it seemed like a really natural fit to be able to put it here. We're also, by having it here and knowing that divers frequently go there, we are able to ask recreational scuba divers to help us record and report their animal sightings through citizen science. So this is now a citizen science project that if any of you are watching are divers and you go to Porto Cove, look out for them and tell us what you see. I'm really curious. We also have a sign that we installed. So I just have a little image now on the left side of your screen that is next to the other sign that is, oops, that is also on your screen. Go back here. So we got this one that was already there. So our new sign is right next to that. So it gives you a little bit more information about the project, what we're doing. And for anyone who's not a diver and visits the park, they can also read about the project and learn a little bit more about rockfish. So to give you a little update on what we've seen a year after installation at Porto Cove, we've been seeing lots of really cool stuff. So in the photos here, you can see some scaly head sculpins. And what I really love about this is you can see that they're actually using all the different parts of the sculpture. So on the left side of the screen, they're in, one of those tubes that was exactly designed for fish to go in there. And there is an exit way on the other side as well, so they can get out in case there's a predator. And on the right side of your screen, you can see another sculpin that's actually in the same sculpture, but just in the top part, just hanging out at that large opening. So lots of different places for them to go. You can also see that sea stars are congregating on these sculptures. And on the right side of your screen, if you look underneath the sculpture that's on the right, you can see there are a couple gobies, some fish. I also know that we saw some shrimp hiding in here as well. So lots of different critters that are coming in, which is really, really exciting. Just a few weeks ago, we had some divers go there and they saw red rockfish and they saw different types of algae. So we're seeing a lot of recruitment on these sculptures, which is really exciting because, again, before these sculptures went in, there wasn't that much at the site. So far, we've got about 41 species that have been observed on this reef. And the only phylum that's missing are sponges. We haven't seen any sponges yet, but that's okay. Sponges usually colonize a little bit later, so I'm hopeful that maybe we'll see some at some point in the future. At this point, we haven't seen any rockfish yet on this site, but I'm also hopeful that maybe one day in the future we'll get some young rockfish or adult rockfish that have moved over and start to make this their home. So when it comes to our second site, that one was installed later. So again, it was just installed in February of this year, right before all the COVID shutdowns. And so because of that, we halted our field work for a while and we didn't actually get out to see it until last month. So you're one of the first people to find out and actually see what we have found. So here's a couple photos. On the left, you can see there is a feather star that has settled onto one of the sculptures. On the right side, you can also see lots and lots of hydroids that have started to kind of grow on that sculpture as well. More feather stars on the left, and another one on the right, so lots of feather stars. But also you'll notice those white dots, those are tube worms. So we're noticing lots and lots of tube worms, which is really neat to see how they have, settled on these sculptures, and there's, again, just so many of them. And then the really exciting thing that we found was this guy right here. That is a quillback rockfish. It's really neat, actually, because when we went down to observe the site, the first sculpture I saw was this one on your screen right here, and there are actually 2 quillback rockfish on there. So I got really excited because I was like, oh my God, we got rockfish finally on our sculptures. One swam away before I could get this photo, but really neat because that was one of our questions is, will rockfish use the sculptures? And yes, they have so far. There are other rockfish that were in the area around the other sculptures as well. So I'm hoping maybe the next time we go back, there'll be more rockfish on these sculptures hovering around them. Super, super exciting. I'll also point out a couple more animals in this photo because I can. On the top, we've got a green urchin. And in the middle here, you'll see this guy. Almost looks like a worm, but it's actually a hermit crab. So lots of different critters that we got to see. When we're comparing the species abundance to Porto Cove, it's not as many, but again, the site was made later, and it's also a very different site. This is more rocky, it's deeper, and it's got a different species composition. So I expect these to increase the longer that we monitor and the longer that we check out these sites, but really great for us to see how species are moving in on these new sculptures that are now there. So if any of you are divers that are watching this and want to know, oh, how can I see these sculptures in the water? How can I get involved? You can. Again, we got that citizen science project, and you can go to Porto Cove. You can look at the sign that we have there. It'll tell you exactly how to get to the sculptures in the water. If you have an underwater camera, take photos. You can send it to us and we can help you to identify what you actually saw. Or if you know what you saw, you can send that to us in our online survey as well. Because the more eyes we get out there, the better we can understand the recruitment. And that's kind of the whole point of citizen science. I can't be there every day, unfortunately. So it'd be really cool if you guys get involved as well. So if you want to learn more, I keep doing that. If you want to learn more, if you want to get involved, I've got our website there. I think Danica also just shared it. And we also have a video that you can watch that shows just some footage of us creating the reef. And it's called Creating Rockfish Habitat that you can find on YouTube. So thank you all so much for listening, for joining me today. I also want to thank Environment and Climate Change Canada for supporting us for this project. And also all the students and everyone involved who supported us. That's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amanda. That was great. Let's see if I can fix that. And I might just mute you for a quick sec. So thank you so much. I really enjoyed seeing actually where they're at with having some of that life growing on them underwater. And so just a nudge to our audience, we really love seeing what you took away from that presentation, any questions that you have for Amanda. And so you can put those in the chat for us or in the Q&A, and I will pull some of those out. We already have a few that came in that I'm looking forward to asking Amanda about, and also really want to give a shout out to some of our audience members that say that they had come across them, the sculptures in Porto Cove, but actually kind of didn't know what they were, so they took them a little bit off guard. So hopefully, people will see them a little bit differently next time they spot them down there. Just before, actually, I was going to say, before you stop sharing your screen, because I don't know if you'll need to bring it up, but we did have our first question was, you mentioned that there are 2 species of rockfish no longer found in Howe Sound, black rockfish and one other, and we just wanted some clarification on what that missing species was.
My sound working? Great. So the other species that's no longer in Howe Sound is Bycatch. They're one of the larger species of rockfish that you find in British Columbia. And if you go to Vancouver Island, you can definitely see them there. I've not seen one yet in person myself, except for at the aquarium, but they're super cool. They're absolutely massive. So definitely, it's unfortunate that they are no longer in Howe Sound.
Thanks, Amanda. Um, and so I think that's actually a perfect next kind of segue into the question that came in about kind of the size and scale of these rockfish and these sculptures. So if you were, and you might get a little bit of an idea of that if you follow the YouTube link to the video that's just in the chat, but kind of how big do rockfish get? Thinking of that image of the rockfish on the sculpture that you shared, kind of how big are these animals and these sculptures?
Yeah, that's a really great question because depending on the species of rockfish, some can get very big, like the Boccaccio, and some actually don't grow that large at all. One example I can think of is the Puget Sound rockfish. They're actually one of the smaller species. They probably get to about the length of your hand, so I think that's like 22 centimeters, something like that. So yeah, they're super, super tiny. Yeah, the size of your hand, an adult hand. And the neat thing about these sculptures is that some artists design them for young rockfish, for baby rockfish, and others design them so that you could have adult rockfish kind of hanging out on them. So um, if you remember, like the first one that I showed that had the sculpins on them in the tube and also in the top of the body, that's kind of like a mixture where you can have the young rockfish and adult rockfish in there because the young rockfish could fit in those small tubes. The adult rockfish could fit at the very top large opening and they can go in and out there. So they're really creative in what they came up with and what they designed. But yeah, the size completely varies and also depends on the age as well. Like when you get baby rockfish, they're like the size of your pinky finger, maybe a bit smaller, super teeny, super cute. I would say like the average size of a rockfish would be like the quillback that you saw hanging out on that sculpture there. That's usually what we tend to see.
Thank you. Oh, now I'm picturing tiny baby rockfish the size of my pinky finger. And so a question that came in from John is, this is such a great program and a great project. Are you planning to extend this and use new sculptures or find new sites?
That is a fantastic question and one I've been asked before. At the moment, we're not planning on adding more sculptures. It's very possible that at some point in the future we could, but I think right now we're more focused on seeing how these ones do and monitoring them first before we decide to make any more. Because again, one of the points of this project to see is, do rockfish use these sculptures? So we saw them on one, and are they only going to go to that one, or are they going to start using the others, and how do they use them? And then from that, we can kind of understand, okay, these are the characteristics, the qualities that are really successful. And if we want to keep targeting rockfish, then maybe we make more of those specific sculptures, or we can make it like a course at a university, which is what we were kind of trying to do at the start of this. And those students can make the sculptures with those certain criteria that we know are really successful. So there is a potential for that to happen, but at the moment we're not planning on putting any more in. But I'm glad that there's interest because that's really good.
Wonderful. Yeah, there seems like there's a lot of opportunity. And so that actually, it's great to hear that you're thinking of kind of maybe it could be a course at the university. And so this next question is kind of what sort of information did the students need to learn about rockfish or the habitats that these sculptures were going into in the process of designing and building?
Yeah, so when we approached the different universities to see if there was any interest or any students who want to be part of this project, our original idea was to make it a course, but the timing didn't work out for that. So we decided because these are art students who probably don't have much, if any, background in biology, except maybe what they did in high school, we offered workshops for them, so either hosted by us or staff from the Vancouver Aquarium / Oceanwise, or we got people, experts in their field to come in and talk to them. So we had different subjects like sustainable seafood. We had subjects on artificial reefs. We had a subject on just rockfish in general. And also about just like the local area, different pollution. And it was kind of like a well-rounded information base for these students, which kind of gave them a better idea and understanding, and also a connection to these rockfish too. I'm sure if you were to meet any of them and ask them, you know, what their thoughts were before doing this project versus afterwards, a lot of them came up to me and were like, oh, I didn't know anything about rockfish before, and now I absolutely love them, and they're so cool. And, you know, that was really heartwarming for me because they're not a charismatic megafauna, but they should be. And, you know, not many people really think about rockfish, to think about, you know, the other bigger, well-known animals, which there's nothing wrong with that. But, you know, the more we can care for the other animals that need our help, you know, the better they are off as well, and the more we can understand as well. So that, you know, is another big learning curve for us, and really cool part of this project.
Wonderful. I love the idea of, you know, incorporating that learning about the biology of these animals and that kind of informing how the artwork comes about. So just, yeah, as an educator, just love everything about that combination. And so thinking a little bit about kind of the biology of rockfish as well as some of the other animals that you were pointing out on these sculptures, and perhaps even some animals that don't look a lot like animals at first glance, like the tube worms that you were mentioning. Are there any animals that I guess you look for in terms of kind of succession of these artificial reefs? Something that would show up earlier, maybe something that moves in later? What are you keeping an eye out for more than just the rockfish using them?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I would say like the tube worms are typically one of the first things that you'll see to colonize on like an artificial reef. So that was a really good sign to see there, as well as like any like diatoms or hydroids or any like small, like in like you said, animals that you don't think are actually animals would start to go there, because they're food for other larger animals and fish. So that's typically, you know, something that might draw them in. Algae as well, seeing algae start to grow there is a really good sign. It also provides extra cover for any animals that start to move into. So having that algae now on one of the sculptures there, if that grows to be bigger and larger, not only does it look super cool on the sculptures, but it just adds that extra element of protection and food for different species. So yeah, again, typically you'd see like tube worms, you might see like some, you know, sea stars and other echinoderms like sea cucumbers, and some fish as well. It's really what's floating around in the water. So what we're seeing now is pretty typical.
Thanks. I think you actually just kind of answered the next question that came in, was how do some of these animals arrive on these structures? Like tube worms, we don't typically think of them swimming around. So you did mention kind of how they arrive, but maybe you could tell us a little bit more.
Yeah, so in the water column, there's lots of plankton and zooplankton that's floating around that's usually invisible to the naked eye. So in that zooplankton, you know, it's tiny little itty bitty animals that are floating around, and eventually some of them have to settle somewhere. So if they happen to be in the area, the vicinity of the sculptures, that's where they're going to settle, and there's no predators there, there's no predators, and it's like, oh, this is new habitat that I can newly colonize and establish. So that's where they're going to latch onto and start to thrive. So yeah, it's usually through the water column. And as I mentioned earlier, my talk, rockfish, they don't really migrate. They are homebodies and they like to stay in one spot. So the thought is because in Porto Cove, there are rockfish that you can find elsewhere in the park and on the other artificial reef structures. So if they were to have babies, they will float around, with the currents in the ocean, and maybe some of them will eventually settle on our reef sculpture. That's kind of my hope anyway.
Wonderful. Yes, fingers crossed for sure. Sounds like a good new home for some young rockfish. And so I think, I get very excited at the idea of, kind of bringing that science and art and education component together. How did you kind of get to starting up this project? Was it your initial idea, or kind of what brought that enthusiasm for bringing those two components together?
Yeah, so this actually was a project that was thought of by someone else before me. So I inherited it. When I started working for the Ocean Biodiversity Research Team, I kind of walked in and my manager was like, okay, we got a couple projects. Which one are you interested in? And it can be yours. And I went, oh, artificial reefs, that sounds really cool. So I wish I had thought of it, but it was kind of handed to me. And then it was just for me to figure out all the pieces of how do I get it started? How do I, find all these artists and put together all these workshops and all the different pieces of actually, getting these sculptures into the water. So it was a huge learning curve for me, but really cool to be able to work with people from different backgrounds and in different organizations, and to pull this off. And for me, like, I've always been interested in habitat loss and artificial reefs as well. So it was kind of in my set of a little bit, I had some knowledge background in this as well, which helped me to decide to take this.
Wonderful. And I think it's great to see that our audience really wants to go visit these sculptures. And so hopefully some of you are divers, but I know that some of you aren't. So Amanda, maybe you could remind us again of the locations of these sculptures, and then I know there's some questions about kind of how deep they are. Could you swim or snorkel to them? Or even if there's any plans to have kind of an underwater camera on them.
Yeah, so of the two reefs, the one that you'll be able to visit is at Porto Cove. So if you drive to Porto Cove, it is a BC park. And again, we have that sign right next to the water. So it has a map on there and it tells you exactly where it is in relation to all the other artificial reefs that are in the park. It is recommended that you visit them if you're a scuba diver. But I will say they're quite shallow. So when the tide is high, they're probably around 30 feet or so underwater. But on an extreme low tide, you might be able to free dive to them. So you don't require any scuba gear. You just take a snorkel and you dive down and hold your breath. Some people are really good at that and they can hold their breath for like 3 minutes, and they can dive down to quite deep depths. And again, at a low tide, it would probably be around like 16 feet. So it can be quite dramatic. So you could definitely check them out that way. And yes, I would recommend bringing a camera so that you can take pictures, not only for yourself, but if you do want to contribute to the citizen science, which I highly recommend, you can send those photos to me through our website and help us again to like track the different species that are congregating there and recruiting that we're seeing. Which was really fun. And then you can say that, you helped research, you helped science, which I would think is exciting.
Wonderful. Well, we definitely hope that you'll be getting some photos from folks. That's excellent. We definitely have a lot of enthusiasm from people wanting to get out and see these. And you know what? Even if you're not a scuba diver yet, that's always a possibility too, to get your scuba certification. And I know as a local diver, I love the Porto Cove site as a fairly entry-level dive site too. It's pretty accessible, and so while 16 feet is beyond what I could free dive to for sure, 30 feet is a pretty comfortable dive for me. So it's exciting. Hopefully, we'll get a lot more people out there to check these out. And so we're just coming up kind of to the end of the program, but I always like to, find out a little bit more about our presenters and their roles. And so I did want to ask, kind of as our last question today, what kind of brought you into this career? It's so wonderful to hear about, these projects that you've undertaken and getting to combine some of those interests of art and science. But for any of our young scientists out there in our audience today, what should they be thinking about in terms of building into their career, and then also thinking about how you got where you are today?
Yeah, I'm always happy to share my story of how I got to be here. And it's an interesting one because I didn't always know that I wanted to be in conservation or, study biology. I always knew I liked biology, but I had a completely different career path for myself when I went to university. And then while I was studying, so I did my undergrad at Queen's University, and it was around third year when I kind of realized like, I really like biology. That's probably something I should pursue. So after I graduated, I continued to do my master's, and I did that in environmental management. And I did that in Australia, which I absolutely loved, and it was so much fun for me because that's where I also learned to scuba dive. You can, of course, learn to scuba dive anywhere there's water, but I was fortunate enough to be able to do it there. And I did it not knowing that I wanted that to be something I always did, or knowing that that wouldn't be a possible future career for me. It was just going to be a hobby, but I completely fell in love. And seeing animals in their habitats, like there's really not much that you can compare to that. It's like such a surreal feeling. So when I came back home to Vancouver, I was able to get a job at the Vancouver Aquarium, and then a position opened up in the research department. I said, this is perfect. It's kind of everything that I want to do. I love to scuba dive. I love to see different animals and working in conservation and protecting these animals. So I was very lucky that they took me and hired me. And that's kind of my story, just doing the things that I love, following my passions. And then that kind of led to a career for me. I didn't even know that this job existed. So I kind of got really lucky that way.
I love that. I feel like we hear that from lots of our presenters, is kind of, not knowing that this particular job existed. And so I think that's a great message to everyone, to be kind of open-minded, to look for those new opportunities that maybe you haven't heard from before. And I think that's really kind of inspiring. One last question, I know we're almost out of time, but was kind of is one thing that our audience can do to help protect rockfish and any further loss of habitat?
Yeah, that's a really great point, Danica. There's lots of things that you can do. First, knowing where your seafood comes from. I'm going to plug the Ocean-wise seafood program, but eating sustainable seafood really does make a big difference, because there are some species of rockfish that are fish that are sustainably caught, and there are some that are not. So if you're going to a grocery store, if you're in a restaurant and see that rockfish is there, it might be sustainable, and it doesn't say, if it doesn't have a logo saying sustainably caught or ocean-wise or whatever, it's important to ask and know where that comes from, because the more we talk about it, the more people become aware, and more people are likely to make changes. And we are the consumer, so people who are making stuff for us should be tailoring to what we want and what we demand. We should be driving the market, is what I think. So that's really the big one, because unsustainable fishing and overfishing, those are all huge issues. Also, another thing I will add actually is, if you do see anyone illegally fishing or, doing a violation on the water, if you see boats and that's a protected area, not just for rockfish, but for any fish, take a picture of that boat, take a picture of the number that's on the side, and submit that to DFO. There's a lot of area for them to cover, and it's kind of like citizen science. They can't be everywhere at once, but the more eyes we have on the water, even if you live on a shoreline and you see something going on, take a picture, call it, report it. Eventually we'll get to it, and they can have, those people will get consequences, because illegal fishing, as I mentioned in my program, that's a big problem, and they don't get caught enough, unfortunately. So that's a big one.
Wonderful. Yes, you can all help be the eyes and ears on the water, and that's extremely helpful. And I did pop the Sustainable Seafood website link into the chat for anyone that maybe hasn't checked out the Oceanwise Seafood Program to learn a little bit more about sustainable seafood here in BC as well as across Canada. So thank you so much, Amanda. That was such a fantastic presentation, and I really love, again, seeing all of our audience responding to, thinking about how they could get involved in an art and science project, as well as to get out to Porto Cove to see these sculptures. So it was very inspiring. We really thank you for sharing that with us today. I'm so thrilled to be able to have more upcoming Tales from the Deep programs for everyone. And so next week at 1 o'clock Pacific time, again, we are going to be having our next Tales from the Deep program with marine biologist Brittany, and she's going to be sharing the not so glamorous life of a marine biologist, 10 reasons why saving whales is tough work. And Brittany's going to be diving into her career as a marine biologist and the animals that she gets to work with. So I hope that you can tune in next week at this same time and learn from Brittany and what she's doing with Oceanwise research. If you did like today's program, we love to hear from you. You can always share your responses with us and tag them #OceanwiseResearch. And that way you can kind of share with others and bring them into the program. Another great way to connect to what's coming up next is to find us on Facebook at the Oceanwise Facebook page. You'll see events posted under the heading of Tales from Deep. And by following that or showing that you're interested in that, you'll get nice handy notifications when our programs are coming up, which is always a great reminder. And it's an easy way to share with others that you're enjoying this program. Of course, we want to stay connected with you at all times. And so you can see what we're working on by following us on Twitter at OceanwiseEDU. You can also check out our live stream program schedule at ocean.org/learnonline. And for finding up-to-date information about what is happening with Oceanwise and the Vancouver Aquarium, you can always visit vanaqua.org/transformation or /support/community to see what is happening with the changes and updates that we're making in 2020 and beyond. So we hope to see you all again next week. And thank you so much for joining us for today's presentation. We're really excited to be back in with our Tales from the Deep programming, and we're so happy to have Amanda kicking that off for us. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.